gunshot rang out in the night. Inside a parked car outside the Hilton Perimeter Suites, 24-year-old Sherika Little lay motionless, blood pooling around her. Moments earlier, she had been alive, unaware that the person she trusted the most was about to pull the trigger. The man holding the gun? Fortune Spencer, a name that, within hours, would send shockwaves through Atlanta. Before the city could even process the brutal murder, chaos erupted. A police officer shot in broad daylight. An elderly woman thrown to the pavement, her car hijacked in a frenzy. A desperate fugitive weaving through traffic, smashing into vehicles, refusing to be caught. What began as one senseless act of violence quickly spiraled into a rampage that left law enforcement scrambling to keep up. How did a single night turn an entire city into a battleground? What really happened between Sherika Little and Fortune Spencer before that fatal shot? And when the case finally went to trial, why did the judge make sure Spencer would never see freedom again? This is the story of a man who chose destruction over remorse, a woman whose life was stolen too soon, and the night Atlanta will never forget. For 24-year-old Sherika Little, life was supposed to be just beginning. Young, ambitious, and full of energy, she carried dreams that, like so many others, were waiting to be realized. Those who knew her described her as warm, determined, and someone who lit up a room with her presence. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She had goals, people who loved her, and a future she never got the chance to fully step into. But in the fall of 2020, everything changed. Sherika had been in a relationship with Fortune Spencer, a man 6 years her senior, someone she had once trusted. Their relationship had its ups and downs, but that wasn't uncommon. To those on the outside, it seemed like just another young couple navigating life together. But what was happening behind closed doors? Were there signs, subtle shifts in behavior, unspoken tensions, that hinted at something darker lurking beneath the surface? Relationships can be complex. They can start with love, promises of forever, and shared dreams of a future. But not all of them last. Some crumble under the weight of unspoken resentment, control, or fear. And sometimes, as in Sherika's case, they end in something far worse. On an ordinary evening in Sandy Springs, Georgia, Sherika found herself at the Hilton Perimeter Suites, a hotel that had likely seen its fair share of guests checking in and out without much consequence. But this night was different. The events that unfolded here wouldn't just be another chapter in her life. They would be the last. What exactly led to that moment? Had she and Spencer argued before she was shot? Had she sensed the danger, seen something in his eyes, heard something in his voice that told her she wouldn't make it out of that car alive? Or had it happened so suddenly, so swiftly, that there was no time to react? One thing was certain: within seconds, everything she had hoped for, everything she had yet to experience, was gone. But this was just the beginning of the night's horrors. Because while most killers flee into the shadows, disappearing in an attempt to escape justice, Spencer didn't just run. He ignited a path of destruction across the city. The crime scene outside the hotel was only the first in a string of violent incidents that would soon unfold. As police were piecing together what had happened to Sherika, Spencer had already moved on to his next victim. Before long, a gunshot rang out again. This time, an Atlanta police officer was left wounded. Minutes later, an elderly woman was thrown to the ground, her car ripped from her hands. And as Spencer tore through the streets in a desperate attempt to evade capture, he left a trail of wreckage behind him. Crashed vehicles, terrified bystanders, chaos spilling into the night. What drove him to this level of violence? Was it panic? A refusal to face the consequences? Or had this rage been simmering beneath the surface for much longer than anyone realized? By the time law enforcement caught up with him, Spencer had left more than just one body in his wake. He had left a city in fear, victims in pain, and a courtroom waiting to deliver a sentence that would ensure he would never be free again. What happened next would shock even those who thought they had seen it all. The pursuit, the arrest, and the trial would reveal the full scope of Spencer's crimes, and the punishment that awaited him. But was justice enough for the lives he had shattered? The night of October 2020 was supposed to be uneventful, just another evening in Sandy Springs, Georgia. Guests checked into their hotel rooms. Traffic hummed along Peachtree-Dunwoody Road, and life carried on as usual. But outside the Hilton Perimeter Suites, inside a parked car, a moment of quiet shattered into chaos. A gunshot. Not a warning. Not a struggle. Just the sudden, violent end of Sherika Little's life. For law enforcement, the details in those first few minutes were unclear. Witnesses reported hearing a shot, but no one saw exactly what had happened inside the car. All they knew was that a young woman was slumped over, blood pooling beneath her, and the man who had been with her had vanished into the night. Her killer, Fortune Spencer, was already gone, but he wasn't running in fear. He wasn't hiding in some dark corner, waiting for the inevitable knock of the police. No, Spencer was still armed, still dangerous, and the blood on his hands wasn't the last of the night. Minutes after the shooting, officers swarmed the scene. Sherika's body was discovered inside the car, lifeless, a single gunshot wound telling the story of betrayal and finality. But the question was, where was Spencer? No one could have predicted how the next few hours would unfold, because while Sherika's family would soon receive the worst phone call of their lives, Spencer was in Hammond Drive, making his next move. Another gunshot echoed through the streets. This time, an Atlanta police intelligence officer was the target. A man trained to handle danger, someone who had likely faced threats before, but nothing could prepare him for the ambush that left him wounded and Spencer still on the run. A manhunt had begun. Police scanners crackled with urgency. Squad cars raced across the city, and the once calm streets of Atlanta were now a battleground. But Spencer wasn't done. For most fugitives, the goal is escape. Get away from the crime scene, lay low, avoid drawing attention. Spencer did the opposite. He wanted speed. He wanted power. He wanted control. Spotting a 70-year-old woman, he didn't hesitate. In one swift, violent motion, he ripped her from the driver's seat, threw her to the ground, and took off in her car. A frail, elderly woman, someone's mother, someone's grandmother, left bruised and terrified on the pavement, watching as the man who had already claimed one life stole his way into another crime. But Spencer wasn't a skilled getaway driver. He didn't move undetected. His recklessness was his downfall. As police closed in, Spencer crashed into multiple vehicles, his stolen car a wreckage of twisted metal and shattered glass. His attempt at freedom was slipping away, and desperation fueled his next move. A third carjacking, this time an attempted one. He had barely pulled himself from the wreckage before he spotted another car, another victim, another chance. But fate had different plans. Before he could rip another driver from their seat, another car struck him, taking him down, stopping him cold. The chase was over, but for the officers arresting him, for the victims left in his wake, and for Sherika's grieving family, this was just the beginning. What had caused Spencer to unravel like this? What was in his mind when he pulled that trigger outside the Hilton Perimeter Suites? And when he stood in court, facing the consequences of his rampage, would he show an ounce of remorse? The answers lay in the trial that followed. A trial that would ensure Fortune Spencer never walked free again. But would justice be enough? By the time Fortune Spencer lay bruised and battered on the pavement, his reign of terror had left an entire city shaken. The streets of Atlanta and Sandy Springs were littered with wreckage, both physical and emotional. One woman dead, a police officer shot, an elderly woman left helpless after a brutal carjacking, multiple vehicles totaled in a desperate escape attempt that had failed. But for law enforcement, the real work was only beginning. Now, it was time to piece together the full story. The Hilton Perimeter Suites was no longer just another hotel. It was a crime scene. Investigators arrived to find 24-year-old Sherika Little slumped over in the driver's seat of her car. The scene was haunting, her body still, the single gunshot wound speaking louder than any words ever could. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that she had tried to run. Whatever had happened in those final moments had been swift and deliberate. But what had led to this? Detectives combed through surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence. Hotel security cameras showed Spencer and Sherika arriving together. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Two people walking side by side, unaware that one of them wouldn't make it out alive. What happened between the time they entered and the time the gun was fired? The forensic team worked quickly, examining the trajectory of the bullet, the placement of the body, and the blood spatter patterns inside the vehicle. One shot, close range. No hesitation. This wasn't an accident. It was an execution. But Spencer hadn't just left behind a body. He had left behind evidence. The casing from the bullet lay in the car, matching the firearm Spencer still had when he was finally taken down during his failed escape. Ballistic testing confirmed what investigators already suspected. There was no doubt that Spencer had pulled the trigger. Now, it was a matter of linking his crime spree to his initial act of murder. Detectives didn't have to search for long. Spencer had made himself impossible to ignore. The shooting of an Atlanta police intelligence officer had already put law enforcement on high alert. His reckless carjacking, the string of crashes, and the failed attempt at stealing yet another vehicle had left a path of destruction across the city. He had all but ensured his own capture. As officers reviewed the police reports from the night, a pattern emerged. The officer who had been shot, his first-hand account confirmed that Spencer had acted without warning. There had been no confrontation, no exchange of words, just a bullet and a wounded officer left behind. The elderly woman who had been carjacked. Her testimony painted an image of a man driven not just by fear, but by a willingness to hurt anyone who stood in his way. The other victims of his reckless driving and car crashes, each one became a witness, adding another layer to the already overwhelming case against him. Spencer had left no room for doubt. He had killed. He had injured. He had terrorized. And now, he would face the consequences. With Spencer in custody, prosecutors wasted no time building their case. Every single crime he committed that night would be counted against him. Murder for the cold-blooded killing of Sherika Little. Attempted murder for the shooting of an Atlanta police officer. Aggravated assault for the violence he inflicted on the elderly woman during the carjacking. Multiple counts of carjacking and vehicle theft, each one adding weight to his already damning list of crimes. Fleeing law enforcement and causing destruction, charges that only reinforced the idea that Spencer had no regard for human life. By the time the charges were formally filed, Spencer was looking at 22 counts, each one a link in the chain that would keep him behind bars. But what would happen in the courtroom? Would he try to defend himself? Would he show remorse? Or would he face his fate with the same cold indifference he had displayed the night he pulled that trigger? One thing was clear, justice was coming. The courtroom was set. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies were damning. But would Spencer accept responsibility for his actions? Or would he fight to the bitter end? The next phase of this case would reveal not just the outcome, but the true depths of Spencer's character. What happened in that courtroom? What did Sherika's family say as they faced a man who had stolen their loved one? And when the judge delivered the final sentence, did Spencer finally understand the weight of what he had done? That's what we'll uncover next. The courtroom was silent, yet the air was charged with an unspoken intensity. Families of victims sat in quiet anguish, their eyes locked onto the man responsible for so much pain. On the other side, Fortune Spencer, now in a prison jumpsuit, sat expressionless. His hands, once gripping a gun, now shackled together, bound by the weight of his own actions. The trial of Fortune Spencer was not just another legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. A brutal murder. A police officer gunned down. A city held hostage by one man's rampage. Prosecutors were not here to argue nuances. They were here to make one thing clear. Spencer was a predator, and his crimes were not impulsive acts of desperation. They were deliberate. They were cruel, and they had left behind a trail of devastation that no amount of prison time could ever undo. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the sequence of events from that fateful night. Every detail mattered. Every crime Spencer committed was another nail in the coffin of his freedom. Sherika Little's murder. Forensic analysts detailed the evidence found at the Hilton Perimeter Suites, the bullet casing, the blood patterns, the autopsy report that confirmed a close-range execution. There was no struggle, no self-defense, just a single, intentional shot that ended a life. The attack on the Atlanta police officer. Body cam footage was played in court, showing the moment Spencer fired his weapon without hesitation. The officer, now in recovery, testified about the fear, the pain, and the sheer unpredictability of the attack. The violent carjackings. The 70-year-old woman, visibly shaken even months later, recounted the terror of being thrown to the pavement, helpless against a man who had no concern for her life. She never saw his face again until today, sitting in the defendant's chair, cold, unremorseful. The reckless rampage across Atlanta. Officers who responded to the series of crashes. Witnesses who saw Spencer's desperate attempts to steal another car before being stopped. Each testimony tightened the noose around him. There was no room for doubt, no ambiguity. Fortune Spencer was guilty. Spencer's attorneys had little to work with. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The ballistic reports matched his gun. His fingerprints were on the stolen vehicles. The victims' testimonies were damning. Still, they attempted to paint a picture of a man who acted in panic, driven by fear rather than malice. They hinted at emotional distress, suggesting that Spencer had not planned the murder of Sherika Little, but had acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage. But the jury wasn't swayed, because this wasn't just about Sherika. It was about everything that followed. A man in distress doesn't shoot a police officer, carjack an elderly woman, and try to steal another car after wrecking the first one. This was not a crime of passion. This was destruction without remorse. Then came the most heart-wrenching moment of the trial, the victim impact statements. Sherika's mother took the stand, holding back tears as she spoke about the daughter she had lost. The phone call she received that night, the silence that followed, the unbearable reality that she would never hear her daughter's voice again. She was 24. She had her whole life ahead of her. And because of you, I will never see her smile again. I will never hear her laugh. I will never watch her live the life she deserved. The pain in her voice was unmistakable. Even the jurors, strangers to Sherika, felt the weight of the loss. Sherika's father, standing rigid, his voice heavy with anger, made one thing clear. There was no forgiveness, no room for sympathy. You executed my daughter. You didn't just take her life. You stole our future with her. You left a hole in our family that will never heal. Spencer didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He sat motionless, as if the words meant nothing. After weeks of testimony, after every painful detail had been laid bare, the jury reached a decision. Guilty. On 22 separate counts, Fortune Spencer was convicted. And then came the sentencing. The moment Sherika's family had been waiting for. The judge's voice was firm. Life without the possibility of parole. Plus 145 years. There would be no appeals, no second chances, no hope of ever walking free. For Spencer, this was the final stop. For Sherika's family, it was justice, but not closure. As the courtroom emptied, as the reporters wrote their headlines, the weight of the verdict settled in. Spencer had taken lives, shattered families, and left scars that would never fully heal. And yet, the question lingered: why? What snapped in him that night? Was it rage? Was it a long-building resentment toward Sherika? What pushed him from being a man in a relationship to a man on a killing spree? We may never know. But one thing was certain: Fortune Spencer would never again take another innocent life. The courtroom had delivered its verdict. Life without parole, plus 145 years. Fortune Spencer would never walk as a free man again. But was that enough? For the families whose lives he shattered, justice had been served, at least in the legal sense. But there is no sentence strong enough to undo a bullet. No punishment that can rewind time and bring back a life stolen in an instant. Sherika Little was gone. And no matter how many years Spencer sat behind bars, her mother would still wake up to a world where her daughter no longer existed. Her father would never get to see her grow, achieve her dreams, or have a family of her own. The people who loved her most would spend every day in the shadow of a tragedy they never could have predicted. And beyond the individuals directly affected, there was a larger question that haunted the case. Domestic violence doesn't always start with fists or gunfire. It begins in small, insidious ways. A sharp word, a controlling glance, an accusation that shouldn't be there. It grows in the space between arguments, in the moments when love turns into possession, when a person becomes something to be dominated rather than cherished. Had there been signs before that night? Did Sherika feel trapped in a relationship that was slowly tightening around her? Did Spencer show glimpses of the man he would become? The man who, when pushed to the edge, wouldn't walk away, but would pull the trigger instead? If we could see the warning signs more clearly, how many lives could be saved? Sherika wasn't just a statistic. She wasn't just another case in a sea of headlines about violence against women at the hands of those who claimed to love them. She was a daughter, a friend, a person with dreams that should have stretched far beyond that hotel parking lot. But her story is not unique. And that is the tragedy. Spencer's crimes didn't stop at Sherika. They bled into the streets of Atlanta, tearing through the lives of people who had never even met him. A police officer, shot while doing his job, left with a wound that would serve as a permanent reminder of a night he almost didn't survive. A 70-year-old woman, thrown to the pavement, her car stolen by a man who never spared her a second thought. Innocent drivers, blindsided by crashes they never saw coming, left shaken and injured because Spencer refused to be caught. When one person chooses violence, the impact is never isolated. It spreads, leaving behind victims who will never forget what was stolen from them. As Spencer sits in a cell, his future erased by his own decisions, the rest of us are left to ask, how many other Sherikas are out there right now, stuck in relationships that could one day turn deadly? How many red flags go unnoticed until it's too late? How do we recognize the moment when love shifts into danger? Because the truth is, this isn't just about one man and one crime. It's about a pattern we see time and time again. Women losing their lives at the hands of those who were supposed to protect them. Sherika's story should not be forgotten, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reason to look closer, to listen, to intervene before the headlines write themselves. Because next time, it could be someone else. And the question is, will we see it coming? If this case made you think, if it made you feel something, then take a moment right now to hit that like button. Not for us, but to bring awareness to stories like Sherika's. Because the more people hear them, the more we can start real conversations about domestic violence, accountability, and justice. If you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover cases like this every week, exposing the truth behind the crimes that shook the world. And most importantly, share your thoughts below. Do you think Spencer's sentence was enough? Could Sherika's life have been saved if the warning signs were spotted earlier? And what can be done to protect others from facing the same fate? We're reading every comment. Let's keep the conversation going.